Greetings, everyone. Our presentation topic is the existing and evolving aspect of mobility in the global south and how these mobilities have been complicated due to the COVID-19 outbreak. I am Doris Wesley, and I'd like to establish my positionality in relation to this research by stating that I am a person of color from an African descent, and my inspiration for conducting this project stems from my interest in working with displaced terrorist survivors affected by conflict and extreme violence in Africa. As I got exposed to and familiar with, some of the mobility literature, I became very interested in understanding what the experiences of these displaced population look like, and as they move from region to region in search of basic mobility, basic resources and amenities during the pandemic.
Right, beautiful. Hi, so my name is Manushree Pandya, and I'm a person of color of Indian descent. My inspirations for the project come from the idea of mobility as a differentially accessed resource. And this idea basically served as a starting point for me to think about how something as basic as movement can be deeply political in nature. Furthermore, my research inclination has been towards understanding how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the communication and mobility networks worldwide, which also guides the focus of this project. One of the aims with this project is to understand how there has always been an inequality in how others move, in the kinds of transportation they use, and in the routes they take.
All right, so awesome. In this presentation, we will provide a brief introduction of what the research is about, and then introduce you to some of the literature and theoretical framework that inform the research project. We will also walk you through the research questions and methods that guides this project, as well as provide some analysis while posing or proposing the way forward to carrying out this type of research.
Right. Yeah. So, as mentioned before, our presentation focuses on the existing and evolving aspects of mobility, and these are of temporarily or permanently displaced populations in East and Horn African regions, as well as India during COVID-19. So just to give some context, this presentation came out of a mobilities and networks class that Doris and I took together, and we worked collaboratively on a digital project which features various maps and visualizations of displaced populations in Africa and migrant populations in India. We both approached the entire project by thinking about the existing differential mobilities and how they've become more pronounced during the pandemic. As you can see, there's a QR code on the screen. You can scan it right now to access the digital project, but in any case, we will be talking about the project shortly as we go. All right.
Awesome. So the problem in carrying out this research, this particular research project, we identified some problems and gaps in previous work on mobility. We identified that, there have been discourses and representations of individuals whose mobilities were affected by COVID-19. However, no focus has been given to how COVID-19 affected the mobility of displaced populations. And by saying this, I mean both internally displaced people and migrant workers in the global south. So we also discovered that no visualization hub has been created to represent and convey the mobility of this population in ways that inform the public. And as such, we kind of took it upon ourselves to seal the loophole by creating a visualization project that explained the experiences of these populations to the general public, to policymakers, to students, to mobility developers, to media practitioners and scholars. And our aim is, for the viewers or for viewers to understand these progressions as contributions to the scholarship of modern mobility and networks.
Right. So obviously, there were some readings that formed the basis of this project. So for instance, scholars like Creswell, Heller, and Salazar have all identified how mobility has changed in a post-COVID-19 world and how it has differentially impacted certain populations. So border closures and quarantines, they're not just examples of restricted mobility, but they also show how fear of the invasive pathogen has been racially associated with the fear of invasive people. And in between quarantines and forced immobilities, displaced populations are faced with their unique set of challenges. Both populations are especially vulnerable during the pandemic as they walk from region to region in search of food, shelter, in search of basic resources, or even safety. So these populations, both the internally displaced populations in Africa and migrant workers in India, they were on the move during the pandemic, which basically explains their connection with mobility and reveals the networks that they experienced and how these networks became even more pronounced during the pandemic.
Yes. So also the concept of network urban rural mobility is discussed by Fern Dendel Pedersen, was also explored to highlight that the process of urbanization has become obvious as never before, because they keep cities, institutions, actors, and forms of life in a global space of flow, even though lives, cultures, and economies are challenged by different mobilities that exist in our world today. So what this basically means is that in today's global world, where network mobility is concerned, there's always an interconnection between rural and urban spaces as individuals move from locations to another. And we'll see how this plays out in internally displaced people and migrant workers during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right. Yeah. And the third aspect that we focus on is creativity for survival. So D'Souza e Silva and Xiang Gam have highlighted that creativity can be observed in groups such as migrant people or people who live in disenfranchised communities like slums or maybe refugee camps, because these locations are organized in relation to the availability of resources. So then it means that the creativity of displaced populations occurs in relation to the access to resources, which were, even less available during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Awesome. So we consider three key elements while examining how mobility is expressed among the displaced populations, and their representation, movement, and practice. We were very interested in understanding how IDPs and migrant workers represent themselves and how they are also portrayed in the media. And as such, we considered what their physical displacement from point A to B looks like, as well as some of the characteristics that define their embodied movement, during the whole crisis situation.
Right. So moving on to the methods, we basically conducted a comparative analysis of the visual and textual data, which was published between March 2020, which was when the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic, and July 2020, because most initial mobilities due to COVID occurred during this specific time period. And by looking at the media reports and images from this period, we were able to understand the mobilities of displaced populations and also try to find out how their patterns were affected because of COVID-19. So as you can see here, we started collecting links of images, media reports, etc., just like any resource that gives us more insight on how these people were moving, both for East Africa right here and for India over here. As you can see, we collected this data in a tabular format, and we were very consistent with the timeline of data collection, and we made sure that all the sources were either published during the given time frame or they were, referring to that given time period. And once we were done with the data collection, the next step for us was to start mapping locations, flows, and media into Google Earth, which was basically the first iteration of the map. And this was then translated into ArcGIS story maps. And we will be talking about this just, shortly as we go through some of the following slides.
All right, so beautiful. Yes, so the Google Earth is going to be playing while, I'm trying to explain what this whole beautiful app is all about. So the Google Earth mapping tool was first used to track and pin, the camp locations as mandatory, as highlighted, affected by, COVID-19, where some IDPs lives. So as it appears, a click on one of the pins, like you can start seeing right now, will provide images that visualize and communicates the experiences of this population during the crisis. And so the interesting thing was that while we started with the Google Earth, the data that's currently in the Google Earth were then transferred to ArcGIS story mapping tool to expand, our work on, creating more stories and, visualizations of the events that happened. Yes.
Yeah. So here's what my Google Earth map looked like. As you can see, at the same thing, I'm just trying for the map to load. Right, so each pin and location here denotes something about the mobilities of migrant workers in India, especially during the lockdown. And so when you click on the pins, you will see images and links that basically tell a story about movement, locations, and representations of these temporarily displaced populations. So for instance, the map highlighted the origin and destination locations of migrant workers, their modes of transportation, and their reasons for leaving the urban areas during COVID-19. Right, so moving on to the next slide, here's a link to our actual project. And again, here's a QR code that you can scan and use if you want to follow along with us. As you can see here, the digital platform has various different things that you can interact with. But for now, for the purpose of this presentation, we will be focusing on the project approach and the maps and visualizations. So moving on to the project approach, one of the things that we wanted to specifically talk about was the definition of key concepts. And these are some of the concepts that we will be using later as examples. So the first concept here is that of restricted mobilities, the first concept that we want to talk about. So we define this as a form of mobility that occurs when individuals who are on the move, they experience some kind of limitation in their movement. And the next kind of mobility is the stigmatized mobility, which occurs when a lot of people unfairly regard a certain population as bad or as having something to be ashamed of.
Yes, so beautiful. So when you can scroll up a little bit. And so another kind of mobilities that we explored was the violent mobilities. And this kind of mobilities occurs, when in response to policing and movement restriction. And this is when, displaced people kind of retaliate against these restrictions that, by using violent means of expressions like throwing stone at the police. And it could be vice versa. It could also be, the police or the security agencies also being very defensive towards, the migrant workers or displaced people as they navigate, their journey during the pandemic. And another thing that we explored, which I'd like to highlight, is the creativity for survival. And this is just basically, the innovations and some of the good ideas and improvisations that some of these displaced populations actually engaged in during the pandemic. And as you can see, creativity can be observed in such a group as migrant workers in India or internally displaced people in East Africa who actually survived in locations such as refugee camps or slums that are organized in relation to the available resources. So it is basically a simple term of using what they have to actually, survive and get what they want. Yes.
Right. Yeah, that was a very important concept. And then moving on, these are some of the maps and visualizations. The first one here is basically a translation of the Google Earth map into ArcGIS so that, it's interactive in some ways. So when you can zoom in, you can click on different locations, you can scroll through the different stories, and the same thing for India as well. Just zoom in, you can click on different pins and locations and then just, explore that story. But this is even more developed in a different iteration of the map. So I'm just going to move on to the flows and tracks of movement. So we wanted to illustrate the flows of movement as well. So we created this map with the intention to, in some ways represent the movement of these people. Hold on, okay, yes. So the red pins here on the Indian map, they represent the origin locations from where, the migrant workers started moving. And then the blue pins here, they denote the destination locations of these migrant workers. As you can see, there's sort of like a concentration of, where these people are traveling to. Right. And then the arrows here, obviously, they describe the flow or the direction of the movement, but the dotted lines here represent that these movements were restricted or forced in some ways. They were, in some ways, they were struggled movements or complicated movements.
Yes. So that's beautiful. And, looking at the section of the East African on the map, which is displayed right now, The red circles actually represent the camp locations where IDPs resided or resides. And then the blue pins actually denotes the urban cities that exist within the region. So you see that the distance between the map, the camps and the urban cities are not too far from each other. And so that shows like this interconnection between urban and rural, cities or areas. And so the dotted line arrows actually communicate the route that these IDPs took during the pandemic in search for food, water, resources, while the arrow itself shows the destination after their movement. And what differentiates the black lines, from the red lines is that the red lines were forced migrations as a result of the pandemic. So the pandemic actually forced this, populations out of their region to another location, while the dotted and the black dotted lines, are normal routes that these, displaced population just take in search of basic amenities. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then as the last visualization, we created an interactive story map, which basically gives you a guided tour through some of the key mobility moments during COVID-19. And each of these has an image or a video embedded within it. You can scroll through different images. You can read some kind of description here. Some of the stories also have links to external articles that you can further explore. So for instance, over here, what we've done is we've given examples for the kinds of mobilities that we identified previously. So for instance, we identified stigmatized mobility, which were defined as occurring when many people unfairly regard a given population just because they're moving, or they're just considered as carrying something bad with them. So here's an example. Some migrant workers were sprayed with disinfectant in India, in a city in India. And this is an example, this is like the epitome of stigmatized mobilities, because these officials thought that that these people carried the virus with them. And so they wanted to spray the virus out of their bodies just so that, just to make sure that they're clean enough to enter a specific city in India, right? And then another example here is of restricted mobilities. So this is an image from a school premises in India where some of the migrant workers were sort of, locked down, like physically locked down. And this clearly relates with how, with the fear of the pathogen, we start fearing people who are on the move. We always, consider them as, maybe having picked up something bad when they're moving from one place to another. And they're restricted. They're basically just, put behind locks just to make sure that they're not leaving the facility and not moving forward in their journeys.
Yes. So yeah, we'll keep scrolling up and then we'll get to a section of, fatality, policing, and mobility. Yes. And so this basically is, keep scrolling up, please. This basically is just actually highlighting the concept of violent mobilities. And as you can see, the image above actually communicated that or displayed that Ethiopian refugee women are actually waiting for non-food items distributed by a particular NGO there in their country. But the sad thing about it is that, we have police and we have all of these security agencies, heavily guarded in those locations, trying to communicate something that shows that, oh, these people might be armed, or these people are not trustworthy, or, what have you. And so we can actually see a particular quote from one of the refugees who was present there, who said, "We've been here for about 3 months. The coronavirus has changed everything. I can't go on. I can't go back because all the borders are closed." So we see that during the pandemic, the borders were closed. But with that, this populations were still heavily restricted and a lot of violence, occurred during their moments there. And then if we keep scrolling up, we'll get to another section that communicates the creativity for survival. And as we can see in the images, there are several images there that communicate how these survivors and these IDPs populations were actually using local infrastructures like plastic, wheelbarrows, their clothes, they would actually meet and create some kind of interesting things that they needed to use while they transported themselves from one location to the other. And this basically just highlights and communicates the idea that, during any form of restriction or any form of lockdown like we experienced during the pandemic, these populations or this particular group of people were constantly improvising and using the tools that they had available for them, available to them to actually get what they wanted in order for them to survive the previous seasons. All right. So we're going back, and the next slide basically is just a way of summing up what we've all explored. I'd really like to suggest that you take some time and go through the links so that you can go through whatever we've shared earlier on and get an in-depth understanding. So interestingly, our research has been has provided a lot of answers to those guiding questions that we asked earlier in the presentation. And so when it comes to representation, IDPs and migrant workers embody and depict themselves in various ways. Mobility is experienced, forced, restricted, hidden, stigmatized, creative, fatal, or violent, and etc., were visually demonstrated in the media more objectively than, relationally. And the images shows that in this visualization orbs, it communicates that individuals were actually represented either by the media or the way they actually portrayed themselves. And when it comes to movement, we can see that IDPs and migrant workers are navigating mobility in distinct and varied, various ways that confirms that, their experiences of either being mobile or immobile, it just explains that there's this form of immobilities and inequalities in the crisis situations, and it tends to precipitate whatever they do going forward. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is especially apparent from the risks that they're taking in navigating different spaces. They're putting themselves in a position of distress. So in a report by the Institute of Human Rights in Business, some migrant workers were interviewed and they literally stated that they would much rather lose their lives on the move than die alone in the cities. So because of that deep desire to be with their families or to be in a safe surrounding, they participate in diverse and creative movements, which basically enable them to reach to a safe place or maybe home for migrant workers in India, just to be with their families. And then for the last aspect here, for practice, the IDPs and migrant workers, they rely on existing daily practices, but also improvising new ways of existential and essential living. So just now, as Doris was talking about the different examples of how they were using creativity for survival, just trying to use whatever, technology or whatever objects they have, trying to appropriate them in order to survive a given situation. So basically creativity and appropriation, it seems, they're at the center of their mobilities. And we're also viewing practice in terms of the objects that they carry with them, because that shows us what holds most value to these populations. So something that can be essential for them could be existential for us, and vice versa, right? So they just have they have to navigate through a different essential versus existential mobility situation where they have to make tough choices. And just because they have to carry things in their hands, they have to be selective in the way that they move and in what they carry with them.
Yes. So beautiful. It's for these reasons that we propose the way forward, and which is to have more mobility visualizations and narrative sharing of these displaced populations, so that we can continue to convey the incredibly complex challenges that they face and the progressions of any crisis event that may occur in the future. We also believe that such a visualization format like we've created will make this information more accessible and engaging for non-academic audiences. You can share the link with your network to expand the chain of informing the public about these displaced populations in the Global South.
Right. Yeah, and these are our references. That is the end of our presentation. We thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.